I really hope you didn't have to play Josh Allen this week, and hopefully you didn't have to play Jordan Addison. I know somebody in the Flock League had to go up against both, and RIP Danny, I am very, very sorry for you. Nonetheless, let's go ahead. Let's talk about every game. Let's talk about how we set up for the fantasy playoffs at this point. Now, going over and looking at what we have starting off with the Jets and Dolphins game. Game goes to overtime, so maybe some of the volume numbers will look a little bit off here. But anyway, quarterback for the Jets, nothing changes. Aaron Rodgers was not interesting before this. Aaron Rodgers is still not interesting after this. Even in a game where you have over 300 passing yards, the man doesn't really pop off the page for fantasy purposes. Obviously, you have no rushing upside, nothing to discuss. Really, what we do need to talk about here is the fact that I thought Braylon Allen was going to see the vast majority of this backfield with no Breece Hall, and what Braylon Allen gives you is a total of 16 opportunities, which 16 opportunities does seem like a decent amount. But if you compare it to Isaiah Davis, a running back that kind of, I don't want to say comes from nowhere, but he also sees 16 opportunities and he gets 6 targets out of this backfield. So for me, this makes it where it's extremely difficult to ever go through and start Braylon Allen, even when you have no Breece, because base expectation, right, is the Jets are a bad offense. So the Jets are a bad offense. And Braylon Allen's splitting this backfield. They're not going to score 26 points every week. Be really tough to start either one of these running backs going into the future. If Breece comes back, obviously you start Breece, but you don't think about it outside of that. Going over to the receivers in New York, obviously we've been saying that Wilson and Adams are must-start guys, even if it's a bad offense. The targets are extremely, extremely concentrated. I mean, this is really outside of Minnesota, I guess now. One of the most concentrated offenses in the entire league, if not the most concentrated. You have a total of 22 targets going to the wide receiver position, and Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson soak up 21 of them. So Adams, Wilson remain must-start wide receivers. They have themselves a fine day. And then honestly, not interested whatsoever looking at tight ends. And yes, we got Danny coming out. I was already saying poor Danny having to go up against Josh Allen and Jordan Addison today. RIP. Can y'all spam the chat? RIP Danny. It's a sad, sad day to be the ladster. But anyway, going over and looking at what we have with Miami, Tua continues to reiterate that, he actually can be a viable streaming quarterback here. Obviously, we're not necessarily saying that he's a must-start guy every single week because he doesn't really have the rushing upside, but the passing volume can consistently be there. I'm going through and looking at what we have at running back. Achane does lead the game at one point. He is good, though. There's really no concern. And you still have the receiving usage, 7 targets, 45 receiving yards. You get the rushing touchdown as well. So Achane still remains a top 3 running back in full PPR formats. I'm going over to wide receiver. We've been standing by that you have to start Tyreek Hill every single week with Tua's in here. I know a lot of people were frustrated with us at the beginning of those calls, but now I think y'all can kind of maybe come around and give your boys some props. Again, I want to reiterate, while Tyreek Hill is probably not the top 3 wide receiver you drafted him to be, it's a very, very concentrated offense here in Miami where the passing volume has been so much more consistent and so much better with Tua under center. Similar to what you were looking at with the Jets, and we'll see other offenses where it's not like this whatsoever. I mean, there are a total of, let's do the quick math here, 28 targets for the wide receivers for the Dolphins, and 26 of them went to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So Tyreek remains a must-start receiver. If y'all were here in the chat this morning and y'all told me to play DeAndre Swift over Jalen Waddle, I'll never forgive you. I'm going to hunt down your names. I'm going to send you those emails. I'm going to write you those angry letters. And you're not going to hear the end of it because Waddle drops 21 points. I benched Waddle this week. Just freaking sucks. I think Waddle is interesting based off matchups going into the future. Definitely not a must-start guy by any stretch of the imagination. Like you look at Waddle in games with Tua playing 100% of the snaps, you had 16 points, then 7, 8, 5, 28, 11, 20. So I don't necessarily know if we can call Waddle anything more than like a wide receiver 3 that's going to give you some pop weeks. And then going down to Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith gets there very late. It was looking really ugly for Jonnu for quite some time. But I think Jonnu remains a must-start tight end every single week regardless. Now going over to Atlanta, Minnesota. This is what, first off all, shout out Underdog Fantasy, of course. That's why we were in the hotel. We were with Underdog this weekend. But thank God Addison comes through for my teams. Y'all know Addison was my most drafted wide receiver on Underdog this offseason. We were pumping Addison, and freaking love it now. But we'll get to the Vikings in just 1 second. Going over and looking at the Falcons, Cousins continues to disappoint from a real-life perspective, but also continues to provide plenty of passing volume for this offense. Even in this game environment, you get the 344 passing yards for Cousins. So I'm still very much interested in the receivers here in Atlanta, even if Cousins himself is not interesting, no rushing upside. And even if the Falcons are disappointing, and maybe you can make an argument that they should be looking at Michael Penix at some point. I don't want to say now. Now, going over to what we have with the running backs, Bijan Robinson, top 5 running back before this matchup, still a top 5 running back after. Nothing changes. Really, the only thing to talk about will be Darnell Mooney, Drake London. If anybody in your league wants to go pick up Ray McLeod for the fantasy playoffs, let them do them. Ignore it. With London, I know it's a disappointing performance where you only get the 12 fantasy points. But at the end of the day, you look at the underlying target volume. This man, 10 targets this week, 16 the week prior, 7, 13. This game with 2, he left early with an injury. He only played 90% of the snaps. You can ignore that. So really you're looking at 10, 16, 7, 13, 6, 8, 10, 13, 12, 9 targets over the past 3 months. Like, London is still a must-start wide receiver every single week. He is still a wide receiver 1 in my rest of season rankings with very little hesitation. Darnell Mooney comes through with the vast majority of the points. Darnell Mooney only has 7 targets. Darnell Mooney's like right in line with what we maybe have with like Jalen Waddle. Wide receiver 3, a flex play consideration. And yeah, if you have not dropped Kyle Pitts, it's time to drop Kyle Pitts. Over the past 3 games played, the man has not had 5 total fantasy points. If you have him, you cut him. You go to the waiver wire and you scour and see if there's anybody that you could potentially look at tight end. Now, going over and looking at Minnesota, Darnold comes through in a big-time way, 34 fantasy points, 5 passing touchdowns. Now, does Darnold change for me from that interesting streaming quarterback every single week to something more than that? You'll see, we moved Kyler down dramatically in our ranks. I'm throwing in the towel with Kyler. Kyler's a bum. I think Darnold is right in the same range. You order these guys whatever order you want. It doesn't freaking matter to me. Like 6 through 11, I know it maybe seems like, oh, Mason, you're crazy. Darnold should be QB6. Baker should be QB11. I don't think it matters. They're all neck to neck to neck for me. I think these are just quarterbacks. You roster 2 of them if you can, and you play them based off matchups. Darnold, phenomenal performance. Helps me out a ton with my best ball teams. Aaron Jones comes through. Aaron Jones has a really nice workload. Aaron Jones looks like a consistent RB2 going into the future. And what is insane in Minnesota is not only do you get the 39 fantasy points for Addison, but you get the 32 points for Jefferson. They are the only 2 receivers to draw a target in this offense. They collectively combine for 265 receiving yards, and there's not a single other wide receiver in this offense to draw a target. Insane? I would love to. Like I said, Addison, my most drafted receiver in underdog drafts, which is the time of year where I'm really starting to pay attention to my underdog drafts, and we are freaking crushing it. Big reason is Addison's given us a couple of these monstrous performances in best ball. It matters a ton. I hope Addison continues to come out here, and I hope I can say, oh, Addison, high-end wide receiver 2 rest of season. Locked and loaded, must-start guy every single week. In reality, I don't think that's really the case. I think Addison's kind of going to be a touchdown or bust option. We go through and you look at the weeks where you've had a touchdown, 39 points, 30 points, 15 points, 16 points, 22 points. You look at the weeks where you don't have a touchdown for Jordan Addison. 9, 4.5, 4.5, 9.5, 6.5, 6.5. So Addison is very much touchdown or bust. I'm going to have him ranked as a low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3. Pray to God I'm wrong. But, well, we'll see. We'll see. And then also with Jefferson, obviously, remains top 5 wide receiver. Nothing to talk about. Hawkinson, probably a tight end 1 that you have to start because the tight end position's a complete debacle. Now, going over and looking at what we have the Saints-Giants game. This was probably the ugliest game if you had to watch something here. Derek Carr going to be out for the season. RIP Derek Carr and RIP everybody in this offense. Alvin Kamara, previous to this, was the top 3 running back in our rest of season rankings for full PPR formats. Kamara is going to get hit with a pretty big decline. No Derek Carr. The offense is going to be much worse. Fewer trips to the red zone. And Condre Miller you actually have a couple other running backs getting involved. I mean, for Miller here, you get a total of 11 opportunities. For Jamal, you get a total of 5 opportunities. So 16 opportunities for these guys in comparison to 22 for Kamara. If it's a garbage offense, Kamara just simply needs more than that. I'm going over to receiver. We talked about MVS being a massive trap. You don't start any wide receiver in New Orleans, of course. And Juwan Johnson, 100% a viable streaming tight end. We'll have him on the waiver wire video. Obviously, no Taysom. He is seeing the expanded workload. Going over to what we have with the Giants. RIP, nastiest offense in the league. It's disgusting. Tracy's the 3-down running back in it, however, so if the game's going to be close, you can probably start Tracy. Low-end RB2 for me in my rest of season ranks. Malik Neighbors is going to continue to dominate the market share numbers here. You have 79 receiving yards for Neighbors and an offense that only has 227 passing yards. So yeah, Neighbors remains in a full PPR format, a must-start guy when healthy, but touchdown upside very limited, and nobody else in this offense is interesting. Going over to Carolina, Philadelphia, the game here had a massive spread. This was supposed to be the most lopsided game in the NFL this week. You had a spread, I believe, of 14 points. And yeah, it ends up being a lot closer. The Panthers offense was decent. We talked about all the Panthers guys being absolute traps here based off the projections you had from sportsbooks. Well, yeah, Bryce Young looked great last week and 2 weeks ago. We looked at a 2-year sample where Bryce Young looked pretty damn bad. So it's a very easy spot to say, okay, well, Bryce Young's going to regress dramatically. Doesn't hit 200 passing yards. Obviously, it's a very tough matchup for Bryce. I don't hold this against him. But still, for the love of God, you never start Bryce Young. Going over and looking at the running backs. So Jonathan Brooks, presumably out for the season. Not only out for the season, but if it is indeed a torn ACL, a non-contact knee injury, God knows what this is. It looks like Chuba Hubbard maybe is going to be viable in 2025 as well. As soon as we get the official word on what this injury is for Jonathan Brooks, I wouldn't be surprised at all if I end up actually running over to my dynasty rankings and moving Jonathan Brooks down in a big time way. Chuba Hubbard looks like a locked and loaded must-start running back every single week going into the future. You have no Jonathan Brooks. You have no Miles Sanders. You have nobody left in this offense. Hubbard is going to dominate. I'm going over to the receivers. We have Adam Thielen coming in with a big performance of 19 fantasy points. I thought Adam Thielen was a trap here, 100% my B on that one. I mean, you get the 11 targets, 102 receiving yards, but it's just very surprising, right? Is he makes up over 50% of this team's receiving output. 192 passing yards for Young, 102 receiving yards for Thielen. So Thielen has to be a riser here because if you get a better game for Bryce Young in the future, Thielen could probably the market share numbers come down, but if the overall volume in the offense goes up, it could outweigh it, and Thielen could be a viable option at this point. Leggett, Dud, David Moore. Drop anybody here not named Thielen, and that's brutal because I have a lot of Adam Thielen. I'm sorry, I have a lot of Leggett in underdog drafts. Trimble gets touchdown. For the love of God, don't look at Trimble. I'm going over to Philly. Hurts, top 3 quarterback before this game, top 3 quarterback after. Barkley, RB1 before this game, RB1 after. Going over to the receivers, I am moving A.J. Brown down. I think you kind of got to throw in the towel with A.J. Brown here. I mean, if you're looking at the amount of 20-point performances that we've had since the bye, he has played a total of, what? I want to say 9 games. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 games. And you've had 2 20-point performances. But just as many games with fewer than 10 fantasy points. So I'm throwing in the towel with A.J. Brown. No longer is he a mid-wide receiver, one of my ranks. He's still somebody you start every single week, but lower passing volume in this offense, of course. Devonta Smith, I started him and got the touchdown, thank God. And I owe an apology to whoever in the live stream this morning wanted to come through and start Calcaterra, and I looked at it and went, are you freaking kidding me? I promise you have a better option on the waiver wire. Do anything you can not to start this dude. While he only has 16 receiving yards, he does come in with the receiving touchdown. So if you started him, congrats. You get the double-digit fantasy points. Would I start him going into the future? Hell no. I'm going over to the Cleveland Browns-Steelers game. You actually had the Browns offense projecting out with an implied team total that put them as a bottom 3 offense in the league this week. There's a spot where you could very easily expect some regression here. It's exactly what happens, but you do have Judy still getting there nonetheless. But Jameis still just a streaming quarterback. If it's a good matchup, you can consider him. Bad matchup, like the Steelers, probably don't want to. Going over to the running backs, any game in which the Browns trail from start to finish, more likely than not, Nick Chubb's not going to see the field. Nick Chubb's going to be a bum, which is brutal. I have Nick Chubb in a lot of underdog drafts, so hopefully Nick Chubb please do something in the playoffs for us. But what's the schedule going to be going forward with the Browns? Can we expect them winning any of these games? Nope. RIP Cleveland. Yeah, Cleveland's not going to be winning this Chiefs game, this Bengals game. Maybe in Cincinnati they can. No, they're not going to be in Miami. So it looks like Nick Chubb just RIP. It ain't happening this year. The offense is too bad. No receiving role. Going over to the receivers, you end up getting 6 targets for Judy. They didn't let, I don't know, a ton of targets go over to the wide receiver position. 6 targets for Judy, 4 targets for Elijah Moore. That's really it. Once you add Cedric Tillman back in here, the targets will probably be dispersed a little bit more. Obviously, David Njoku just is an absolute target hog here with the 13. Njoku's the guy that comes through in a big-time way for you. And yeah, David Njoku remains a must-start guy every single week. I think Judy's probably a must-start wide receiver at this point, especially if you have no Tillman. Okay. Now, going over to what we have with the Steelers. Russ was a streaming quarterback before this, streaming quarterback after it. Doesn't change anything. Obviously, you're never starting him with no Pickens. I started Najee this week. I got all pumped the second that we got the rushing touchdown. But Najee gives you absolutely nothing as a receiver, so just who freaking cares? Jalen Warren's still a premium handcuff that you can start if you're super desperate. None of the receivers here are interesting outside of George Pickens, of course. And Pat Frymuth screwing us in every way imaginable. Or Pat Frymuth with the revenge game against yours truly does drop 14 fantasy points. It was brutal. He only had 3 targets. He got the receiving touchdown. But looking at the passing volume that you had in Pittsburgh, and Russ only completed 15 passes, right? They were just able to run the ball consistently here. I mean, if you're looking at the amount of carries, you had 29 carries in comparison to 26 pass attempts. So naturally, Steelers are winning the game. You have no Pickens. They're able to just run consistently. Now, going over to the Raiders-Bucks game, you have Aiden O'Connell out for the season at this point. So now, a long time no see Desmond Ridder. Welcome to Las Vegas. I guess the NFL scripts, the script writers, they know what they're doing. We get a revenge game for Desmond Ridder going up against the Atlanta Falcons this next week. But Sincere McCormick actually gets there with double-digit fantasy points, which is surprising in my mind, to be honest. I thought that was going to go very poorly for a lot of people. Obviously, it didn't crush it, but still. And once you get like maybe Madison back in, maybe if you get Zamir back in, we just have no idea what the amount of injuries that are here in Las Vegas. Is a 2-11 team that's on their 4th quarterback or their 3rd quarterback. I apologize. No way in hell I'm starting any of these just Jag running backs. Going over to the receivers. Again, I'm not a super big Myers guy just because how bad this offense is. But I will give him his credit. It's a super concentrated offense usually. Michael Mayer actually gets involved here a bit. I'm not super concerned about Bowers, though. I mean, if you look at Bowers, the previous 3 games to this, the man had 35 targets. I'm sorry, he had 40 targets in 3 games played. So Bowers still going to dominate. Michael Mayer, good player, but no interest in fantasy in a garbage offense. Myers, he'll have targets, but the offense is just horrendous. And O'Connell is already out for the season. I see people in the chat asking if he's going to be good. Last I saw, I think he's out. He's already ruled out for the year. Could be wrong. I'm going over to Baker. I think that Baker, again, is a much more interesting player now that you have Evans back in this offense. If you go back and look at what Baker did through the first half of the season, I mean, all the way up until the Baltimore game, this man was the QB2 in fantasy. He was phenomenal. Then you had the injury to Godwin and Evans. We were like, okay, well, you're going to see a massive step backwards. That's exactly what you had. But now that you have Evans back in, we get another game with over 20 fantasy points for Baker. I think Baker is one of the better streaming quarterbacks that you can be looking at. Going over to running back, this is where things are really crappy. So right after I end this live stream, I've already been tinkering with it for like literally the last 3 hours. All I've been doing is updating the rankings over on flockfantasy.com. So of course, if you haven't done so already, go over to flockfantasy.com. You can see my updated rest of season rankings already. Just make sure can also, obviously here's the create version of this. What y'all would look like on the user end is just go over to rankings, hit sort by. If you're a member of the site, you can hit sort by Mason Dodd and then go through and sort by my ranks. But I will say it's tough right now to figure out how the hell are we ranking these Tampa backs. Because if you look at this, if Rachaad White is the guy, if you have no Bucky Irving, you have a receiving role, you'd assume that the Bucs are favored over Dallas and Carolina. You have 2 favorable matchups in the fantasy playoffs. It's tough to try to rank Rachaad White, Bucky Irving rest of season. Can y'all, I don't even know what to ask y'all. Just yes or no question in the chat. Does Bucky Irving play next week? I have no idea. I've been scouring the internet trying to find answers, and I can't. Does Bucky play next week? Yes or no? And then going over to the receivers, McMillan, what's hilarious is this dude does nothing when you have no Godwin and no Evans. He's rostered in 12% of leagues at this point. The 12% of people rostering him are the people that gave up on fantasy football back 2 months ago. He comes through with the 22 fantasy points. Don't pick him up. The only guy that's interesting here is Evans. He remains a must-start option every week. And then Cade Otton is also going to be a tight end that you can very easily play as a tight end 1 because the position is garbage. Okay, looking at the people in the chat, we got no, 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 doubt it, no, no, yes, no, no, yes, no, yes, no. It's just so tough to know. Like I'm going to have to make the rest of season ranks and say... I have no idea what's going to happen here. You do you. What I do know is going to happen, which I can actually be pretty confident with. And y'all know, very rarely am I confident with things. 99% of the time I go, I'm an idiot. Don't want to listen to me. Listen to people in the chat. Listen to people in the comment section. They know what they're doing. But I am pretty confident that we are actually going to be getting at least 1 passing yard for Joe Burrow tomorrow night. If you are confident with that, or if you have confidence in me, you can find this free pick on Underdog Fantasy more than less than half a total yard for Joe Burrow. With the link in the description, link in the comment section, link in the live chat. Promo code FLOCK will give you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you'll be getting that free Joe Burrow pick more than less than half total yard. And I'm going to fill you all in on what I desperately need in the Flock League this week. There's so much that happened that I'm not going to give away too much until the video on Tuesday. What I really need is I need Dowdle to outscore CeeDee Lamb tomorrow night. Please, Rico, come through. Come through for us. Underdog right now is Rico, higher, lower, 90.5 total yards. Lamb, higher, lower, 73.5 total yards. They have a points projection out. They have Rico, higher, lower, 13.35 points. They have Lamb higher, lower 13.55. But Underdog, oh no, that was Higgins. I apologize. What do they have Lamb at? Higher, lower 12.75. Okay, so Underdog has Rico scoring more points, but Underdog is also half PPR, whereas my league is full PPR. Okay. But let's move this over to what we have with the Jags and Titans. Now, this is going to be fun to talk about. Again, going back to I'm an idiot. I get things wrong all the time. But one thing I'm pretty damn good at, and y'all got to give me credit, is when there are these bum wide receivers that pop up that people get excited about. I'm pretty consistent in saying, don't fall for the trap. It's a clear trap. There has never been a clear trap in fantasy football. Never, ever, ever. The Nick Westbrook Akine. Tomato, doesn't matter. We went through and looked at this in the live stream this morning. Begged and pleaded for y'all to bench this dude. 27-year-old receiver and an absolute garbage offense that's been averaging 5 targets a game. There's absolutely no reason to ever start a player like this. It'd be different if he came in and he was like, oh, okay, he's had a game with 20 fantasy points and he's averaging 9 targets a game in a garbage offense. Hope you didn't fall for the trap. Hope you avoided it. I'll drop him at this point, honestly. Like, you have Levis injured now. Ridley's obviously the guy dominating with targets. Ridley has 12 targets. None of the tight ends are interesting. Tony Pollard was actually a very interesting play this week. The reason being is you actually had the Tennessee Titans favored by about 5 points in this matchup. But yeah, Pollard gets all the work, but the fantasy points are just kind of whatever because the touchdown's not there and the receiving usage isn't great. But the issue is, hell, in Tennessee, there aren't going to be a lot of touchdowns to be scored, right? Going over to Jacksonville, not too much to discuss. Bigsby, Etienne are split in the backfields. I guess Bigsby maybe helped out an underdog team or two of mine. Bigsby was one of my most drafted running backs this year. Process-wise, felt like it was pretty damn good. Obviously, now that the offense is garbage, there's just no hope for either one of these players. Going down to what we have with the receivers, the only guy that's interesting is Brian Thomas. And there's a big difference between like Nick Westbrook-Akine and Brian Thomas, right? They're both garbage offenses, but you have one dude here that is a round 1 NFL draft pick that's a rookie that's dominating the targets in his offense versus the receiver that's 27 years old that's never done anything, that's not drawing a lot of targets, that kind of got lucky with touchdowns for a while. So this is the profile that you always want to be avoiding and you want to label as a clear trap. This is the profile where you go, he's a viable play. He's drawing the targets, 22 targets over the past 2 weeks. He has the talent profile. Yes, it's garbage offense, but if you're going to get the market share numbers, you can still be an okay play. It's just wide receiver 3 in my rest of season rankings because the offense is horrendous. I'm sorry to keep on doing victory laps. Y'all know 99% of the time I have to go, I'm sorry, I'm stupid. I know I got this wrong. But, our Zach Charbonnet immediate RB1 play looks pretty damn good. Charbonnet coming out, dropping a 38-point bomb. You'll love to see it. We talked about Charbonnet not just being one of these mediocre fill-ins. He's not Sincere McCormick. No, this is a stud at UCLA. This was a round 2 NFL draft pick. And we said it at the beginning of the year. We said it this week. Say it next week. Any week that you don't have Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet is immediately a running back 1. You have the size for a 3-down workload. You have the receiving involvement as well. Here he had 7 receptions this week. Love to see it. Bush came through for us in a big time way. Could not be better. Now, honestly, going into the future, this is the kind of performance from Charbonnet where I don't think they can throw him on the bench. I think if Kenneth Walker's healthy, Walker's probably the running back 1 here in Seattle. But Charbonnet probably still has a very real workload in this backfield. I'm probably not starting Charbonnet in fantasy with Kenneth Walker good to go, but I think it eats into Kenneth Walker and maybe makes both running backs less interesting. Going over to the receivers, I'm waving the white flag. Let me see if I got a white flag here. I got a piece of paper. Can we use this as a flag? I'm waving it. Okay. It's over. It's over. It's done. And I'm not done. I'm in the playoffs. Hopefully I have a bye. We'll see what happens tomorrow night. But freaking DK Metcalf. Why did I trade for this guy? We get the 8.9 fantasy points this week, 10 the week before, 9 the week before that, 14 the week before that. The last time you had a 20-point performance from DK Metcalf was week 3. We've officially moved DK Metcalf down to a wide receiver 3 in our rest of season ranks. We have him next to like DJ Moore, Jordan Addison. We officially have Jackson Smith-Njigba as the wide receiver 1 in Seattle in our rest of season rankings. I feel like a chump. I feel like an idiot for trading for Metcalf. I gave up effectively what the trade kind of came down to is I gave up Ladd and Javonte for Najee and Metcalf. So at the time I was feeling great about, but now I just straight up way rather have Ladd McConkey than Metcalf. And yeah, JSN, this is his 6th straight week leading the Seattle Seahawks in fantasy points. JSN, clear wide receiver 1 here. Lockett, very easy player to drop. I think we've talked about that for a month now. No interesting tight ends here in this offense. And going over to Arizona, I want to say, oh, let me wave the white flag, blah, 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 because we had previously been ranking Kyler as one of those quarterbacks you just simply have to start because of the rushing upside. Horrendous day for Kyler Murray from a real life perspective. Fantasy is still whatever. You still get 20 fantasy points. The rushing's not great. The rushing was definitely a hell of a lot better at the beginning of the season than it's been. The next few matchups for the Cardinals, though, like you go up against New England, you're not going to have to throw the ball a bunch. You're not going to see a bunch of Kyler Murray dropbacks. You go up against Carolina, you're not going to see a bunch of dropbacks. Against the Rams in the championship, I'm assuming, yeah, obviously we'll talk about what Allen just did to the Rams. Maybe Kyler's great then. I have James Conner, and I'm really excited about Conner in the matchups that you have coming up here. I think it's going to be an offense that can actually run the ball consistently. James Conner crushes with the 22 fantasy points. I think Conner remains a must-start running back every single week. Harrison only gets you about 9 fantasy points, but I do want to point out that if anything, it's I don't want to say positive for Harrison, but he get 8 targets. Like, could have been a hell of a lot worse. You go through and look at this. You have Harrison setting his career high in targets last week with 12. You have 8 now. Obviously, McBride's the number 1 player in this offense. You get the 14 targets for McBride. I kind of want to move Trey McBride ahead of... I'm going to move Trey McBride ahead of Brock Bowers in our rest of season tight end rankings. It's obviously just a significantly better offense that you have here in Arizona, especially as you have the additional injury in Las Vegas. Now, going over to Chicago, San Francisco. We talked about the expectations for the volume to come down dramatically in terms of the passing yardage here in Chicago. Actually does turn out to be true. You only have 134 passing yards for Caleb. He's still he's not great in fantasy. He only get 14 points. I started this dude, DeAndre Swift. Now I'm gonna do what y'all do to me. It's only fair, right? I make a bad call, everybody comes and they blame all their struggles on me. I asked the chat this morning, do I start DeAndre Swift or do I start Jalen Waddle? And y'all overwhelmingly told me DeAndre Swift. Yes, I'm talking to you right now, okay? So, I give public apologies all the time. I eat crow all the time. I think it's your time. If you told me to start DeAndre Swift over Jalen Waddle, I expect an apology in the chat. And now we got the people saying, I would have told you Waddle. I said Waddle. No, 99% of y'all said Swift. Yeah, now we got everybody in this is what I'm going to start doing to y'all. This is what I'm going to start doing to y'all. Yeah. We got two people willing to say sorry. This friggin' sucks. Obviously, we can say, okay, well, they get a boat race. It's not the game environment for DeAndre Swift. But yet again, Swift just looking horribly inefficient. The thing with Swift is, how does this turn around? You play Minnesota this next week. Yeah, Bijan can score against Minnesota. The Bears and DeAndre Swift's not going to be able to. You play Detroit in week 16. I am not playing DeAndre Swift again. I'm not doing it. Honestly, at this point, I'd freaking rather start Ramondre Stevenson over DeAndre Swift. This is, over the past 5 games, you've had one game with more than 10 fantasy points. You haven't seen more than 20 fantasy points since back in week 6. I'm done with it. And you also had no Roshan this game. If Roshan was good to go, you maybe could have had an even smaller workload for Swift. Going over to the receivers. Also, I expect an apology if you got mad at me for ranking DJ Moore as a low-end wide receiver too. Come on. Again, you have Rome, Moore, Keenan, all competing for targets. When you have a couple games from Caleb over the past 2 weeks, where he goes through and he averages 300 passing yards a game, the receivers are going to look good. But just looking at the larger sample, it's very difficult to expect that kind of passing volume to be there. Now, of course, Caleb's probably going to be better going to the future than what he just was. But still, at the same time, very difficult to be looking at DJ Moore as like a wide receiver 1 by any stretch of the imagination. Keenan Allen's a volatile desperation play. Rome Odunze, you get multiple receiving touchdowns, but Rome's also just a volatile play here as well. And Cole Kmet's, did he play? RIP. Going over to San Francisco, I started Purdy. I started him over Stafford. This was super interesting. Isaac Garindo, I didn't know exactly what to expect in terms of the split that you were going to have here in San Francisco this first weekend. And Garindo looks like if he would have stayed healthy, he would have been a running back 1 in the rest of season rankings after this week. The man gets you only 50 receiving yards off of only 2 targets. But he is the clear guy. He's super efficient. It's just the perfect team to run the football. But now he sprains the foot, and you have no idea if he's going to be good to go. So now they may be going over to Patrick Taylor. And I have no idea what to expect. This is just a cursed running back room. Patrick Taylor, obviously, going to be probably the number 1 waiver wire pickup this week. We'll talk about him in the waiver wire video. And then going over to what we have out wide receiver. And we have people in the chat saying that he said he would be good to play Thursday. If Garindo is good to play Thursday, Garindo is an RB1 in fantasy. Very easily. I'm going over to what we have at wide receiver here. Juwan Jennings also, we got to move this guy up dramatically in our rankings. We've already played around with this a bit. We moved Jennings up to wide receiver 20 as a must-start wide receiver every week. And the thing with Jennings is, if you go through and look at every week since he's returned, you've had 16, 25, 9, 8.5, and 28 fantasy points. Let's run through the 2 games that look like an outlier with the 9 and 8.5 fantasy points. This game against the Packers, you had no Brock Purdy. In this game against Buffalo, it was the snow game where nobody could throw the ball and they were just running over and over and over again. So weeks 12 and 13, you could almost throw out the window for Juwan Jennings. And if you do that, you're looking at games with no Brandon Ayuk of 16, 25, and 28 fantasy points. Jennings, absolute must-start option every single week going into the future. Phenomenal. It's laughable that all offseason I was drafting Ricky Pearsall at the end of underdog drafts instead of Juwan Jennings. It's embarrassing. And I would do anything. I would do unspeakable things to switch all my Ricky Pearsall shares on underdog over to Jennings. Debo, also, what the hell are you doing? The Niners are on their 4th running back. There's no Ayuk. The Niners are dropping 38 points. 5.5? You haven't scored double-digit fantasy points since week 10? You haven't scored 20. You've scored 20 fantasy points once all season? It's so bad. I don't even know where we put Deebo Samuel down at wide receiver 30. Honestly, Deebo's too high at wide receiver 38. There's no world in which, even if you're getting the pass catchers back in Buffalo, there's still no world in which I'd rather have Deebo over Shakir. Deebo's wide receiver 41 in my rest of season rankings for now. And obviously, we may end up changing that around a bit. Horrendous. Kittle, elite tight ends. There's really just that tier of 3. There are 3 elite tight ends with McBride, Kittle, and Bowers. I wish Laporta was one, but sadly he ain't. Going over to what we have with Buffalo and Los Angeles. I was driving during this game, so I got to see a total of 0 seconds of this. I saw a little recap during the halftime of the Chiefs-Chargers game. But sadly, I did not get to watch it. I was just looking at my fantasy football group chat the entire time, and people were going nuts because of the Josh Allen 51-point bomb. Just insane. How is Josh Allen only the quarterback 5 going into this? But obviously, you could say, okay, after this 51-point performance, I'd imagine Allen's maybe the QB1 in fantasy in total points scored so far this season. You get 6 total touchdowns. This effectively cements Josh Allen as the MVP of the league. In terms of if you want him or Lamar rest of season, it's up to you. Frankly, it doesn't matter. Really, the only thing that you could ask yourself is where do you put them in your overall rankings? Where do we have Josh Allen and Lamar? I'd rather have them over St. Brown and London in our overall rankings rest of season. I think we have them 15 and 16 overall. But clearly elite. But, nothing really changes. You're starting them every week before. You're starting them every week after now. Going over to what we have with the running backs here. You have James Cook and Ty Johnson splitting. Again, like I said, I saw a total of 0 seconds of this game. I was sadly having to drive, but I'm assuming James Cook's fine. From what I can tell, it just looks like a very weird game environment. Yeah, the opportunities, you only have a total of 8. But if you just take a step backwards, this is the first single-point performance that you have from James Cook since week 7. I'm assuming he's still going to have the majority of the carries inside the red zone. And at the same time, he's going to have receiving usage. So, again, I'm assuming James Cook's going to be fine. We're going to dive into a little bit more, but, after this with the snap rates. But I'm going over to the receivers. You have Shakir with the 21 fantasy points. Again, when you get Keon Coleman in, when you get Kincaid in, I'm going to assume that the targets are a little bit more dispersed, where none of these receivers are super interesting. Amari actually pulls in 14 targets. Amari is the wide receiver 1 on paper. But again, when you get Keon, when you get Kincaid, and I'm not saying that, Keon Coleman's going to be the wide receiver 1. But I think if it just gives Josh Allen another viable pass catcher, and what we saw earlier in the year is that they were willing to just really cycle through these receivers, and they're not having to put a single player out there for every single snap. I think it will take some away from the wide receivers here. Going over to the Rams, I benched Stafford. It was a really tough matchup against the Bills. I played Purdy instead. It would have worked out regardless. They're about the same. Stafford remains a quarterback that is definitely a very viable streaming option since you've had the addition of Cup and Puka back in. 25, 18, 10, 27, 19, 15, 20 fantasy points. Again, no rushing upside though, so nothing more than a streamer. Going over to running back, Kyron still dominating the workload here. 31 total opportunities. Again, the receiving involvement has gone down since you've had the addition of Cup and Puka. And Puka with the rushing touchdown, the receiving touchdown, the 14 receptions, 162 receiving yards. I have officially moved Puka up our rest of season ranks. I believe he was previously behind St. Brown, behind London. We've moved him up to wide receiver 4. And honestly, this may be a little bit too low, because it's a super concentrated offense. You have Cup here with the 8 targets. Obviously, Cup's still a wide receiver 1 in his own right, but no tight ends are getting involved. It's not like you really have to worry about any of these receivers. Like, out of the 30 total pass attempts in this offense, you get a total of 22 of them going to the combination of Puka and Cup. So if you wanted to move Puka up ahead of, if you want to move him up to wide receiver 2, I don't care. Obviously, the only guy you can't have ahead of him is Chase. Going over to the Chargers and Chiefs, this game I watched from start to finish. Herbert, incredible performance given the context of it. You have absolutely nothing. Your number 1 running back's Gus Edwards. Your number 1 wide receiver is Quentin Johnston. And Herbert still comes through, keeps the Chargers in the game. Fantasy purposes, Herbert's just a streaming quarterback that could be viable if Ladd is available. Edwards, no receiving usage whatsoever. Split in the backfield with Vidal. Not interested in either back. Receivers, Quentin Johnston is a desperation play if you have no Ladd McConkey. But once Ladd comes back in, Ladd's a must-start option. If you were convinced that Will Dissly needed to be started for whatever reason, hopefully you've learned that that's not the case. Going over to the Chiefs side of things, Mahomes, just a streaming quarterback. Obviously, this is a team that it hasn't had a ton of passing volume all season. Pacheco does really take over here as the lead feature back. You get a total of 18 opportunities in comparison to Kareem Hunt at 6 and Samaje Perine at 3. I figured Perine had a little bit more than this. Seemed like every play he had was a pretty big one. DeAndre Hopkins has the 9 targets. Xavier Worthy gets 6. I figured Juju had more than 2 as well. But nonetheless, the desperation plays at receiver. Not a lot of passing volume in this offense. And then Kelsey remains a must-start tight end every single week. But again, and definitely not in the same tier as what you have with the big 3. And you are really just having to start him every week because the tight end position is a complete debacle across the board. And yeah, I understand that Dissly was injured at the end of the half, but still, before the Will Dissly injury, he still did nothing. Are you starting Will Dissly in week 15? I'd make the argument, do not start Will Dissly in week 15. But it was funny. Danny was spazzing in the chat the second that Dissly did get injured. But I think that should be it for this stream. Really hope that you were able to win this week. And again, if you have not done so already, I'd really appreciate it if you go down there, drop a like on this stream. I can't believe we streamed for 48 minutes. Whenever we do the video recaps, they're literally half this length. What the hell have I been talking about for 48 minutes? But again, really appreciate y'all and really hope I get to see you out with the live stream tomorrow night.